Why does it feel like God is making you wait when you've already done everything He asked? You prayed, you prepared, you obeyed. You became the person you thought you needed to be for the door to finally open, and yet nothing moves. No answer. No breakthrough. Just silence stretching longer than your strength can handle. And the hardest part isn't the delay itself. It's watching your faith slowly turn into exhaustion. Because deep down, you start wondering if maybe you were ready. But God changed His mind. But what if this waiting season has nothing to do with punishment, denial, or being forgotten? What if the reason God is making you wait is far more important than you realize? You have tried to stay faithful. You have prayed when you were tired. You have trusted God when your emotions were unstable. You have obeyed even when nobody noticed your sacrifices. And yet, despite all of that, there is still a part of your life that feels painfully unmoved. That is what makes waiting so difficult. Not just the delay itself, but the confusion inside it. Because from your perspective, you are ready. Ready for the door to open, ready for the prayer to be answered, ready for clarity, ready for change, ready for relief from this exhausting cycle of hoping, waiting, questioning, and trying again. And maybe that is the hardest part to explain to other people. Outwardly, your life may still look normal. You continue working, speaking, functioning, smiling, and carrying responsibilities. But internally, there is tension that never fully leaves your mind. A constant question that follows you into quiet moments. God, why am I still here? You thought by now things would be different. You thought the breakthrough would have happened already. You thought the opportunity would have arrived. You thought the burden would feel lighter. You thought the silence would have ended. Instead, the waiting continues, and slowly, something dangerous begins happening inside the heart. When waiting lasts longer than expected, what first started as patience can quietly become disappointment. Prayer can begin feeling repetitive. Faith can start feeling fragile. Hope can begin feeling exhausting, because there is a limit to how long human emotions can carry uncertainty before fear starts speaking louder than trust. At first, you tell yourself to stay strong. You remind yourself that God is faithful. You repeat promises you once felt deeply connected to. But as days turn into months, and months turn into longer seasons, your emotions begin asking questions your faith struggles to answer. If God hears me, why is nothing changing? If God knows I'm ready, why does He keep delaying? Why does it feel like everyone else is moving forward while I remain stuck? Those thoughts do not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they enter quietly, slowly, patiently, like shadows growing in the background of the mind. And this is where many people begin misunderstanding what waiting actually is. They assume waiting means God is distant. They assume silence means disapproval. They assume delay means denial. But one of the most painful realities of spiritual growth is that God often works in ways that do not immediately comfort human emotions. Because emotions want immediate explanations. But faith grows through trust before understanding that is uncomfortable for the human heart. Especially when you truly believe you are prepared for what you are asking God to do. You look at your life and think, I've learned enough. I've suffered enough. I've prayed enough. Why is this still not happening? And beneath those questions is something even deeper, the fear of being forgotten. Not always consciously, not always openly, but quietly, internally. Many people in waiting seasons begin wrestling with a feeling that maybe God has overlooked them. You may continue believing in God while simultaneously struggling to believe He is actively working in your situation. That inner conflict creates exhaustion, because now the battle is no longer only about the external delay. The battle becomes mental, emotional, spiritual. You'll start overanalyzing everything. Every closed door feels personal. Every silence feels intentional. Every delay feels like evidence against your prayers. And without realizing it, your thoughts begin interpreting God through disappointment instead of truth. This is why waiting becomes so spiritually intense. It exposes what controls your mind when certainty disappears. Anyone can feel secure when life moves quickly. Anyone can trust easily when prayers are answered immediately. But waiting reveals what happens inside you when visible progress disappears. And that revelation can feel deeply uncomfortable. Because sometimes waiting reveals fears you did not know were controlling you. Fear that life will never change. Fear that you missed your opportunity. Fear that God is blessing others while remaining silent toward you. Fear that your future is uncertain. Fear that maybe your prayers are not enough. Fear that maybe you are not enough. Those fears become louder in silence. That is why waiting can feel heavier than suffering itself. At least suffering often gives visible reasons for pain. Waiting, however, forces you to sit inside uncertainty without clear explanations. And human nature hates uncertainty. The mind wants control. It wants timelines. It wants visible movement. It wants guarantees. But God rarely builds deep faith through guarantees. Instead, He often allows seasons where you cannot rely on visible evidence. Not because He enjoys watching you struggle. Not because He is ignoring your pain. But because there are things happening beneath the surface that you cannot yet see. Still, that truth is difficult to accept emotionally, because when your prayers remain unanswered, your emotions naturally begin creating interpretations. And emotions, while real, are not always reliable. Feelings can convince you that silence means abandonment. Feelings can convince you that delay means punishment. Feelings can convince you that God's timing is unfair. But feelings do not always tell the truth. This is one of the deepest struggles during waiting seasons. The conflict between what you feel and what is actually true. You may feel forgotten while God is actively preparing something. You may feel abandoned while God is protecting you. You may feel delayed while God is developing you. But in the middle of waiting, those distinctions are difficult to see clearly, especially because modern life trains people to expect speed, immediate responses, immediate results, immediate progress, immediate clarity. But spiritual growth rarely happens immediately. In fact, some of the deepest transformations God performs happen slowly, quietly, and invisibly. And that invisibility can become frustrating, because you cannot measure internal growth the same way you measure external progress. You can see opportunities, you can see achievements, you can see movement, but you cannot always immediately see what God is doing inside your heart. Yet often, that internal work becomes the very thing God prioritizes most, not because the external answer does not matter, but because the condition of the person receiving the answer matters too. And this is where many people become emotionally conflicted, because part of you genuinely trusts God, but another part is tired of hoping, tired of wondering, tired of trying to stay spiritually strong while emotionally drained. You still pray, but sometimes your prayers feel heavy now. You still believe, but sometimes fear speaks first. You still trust God, but some days that trust feels weaker than before. And maybe you feel guilty for that. Maybe you think strong faith means never struggling emotionally. But throughout Scripture, people who deeply trusted God still wrestled with confusion, fear, grief, and waiting. The Bible consistently presents God's Word as reliable truth, even when human emotions fluctuate and circumstances remain unclear. That matters, because your struggle does not automatically mean your faith is failing. Sometimes it means you are human. Still, there remains an important question beneath all of this tension. Why would God allow waiting when you already feel ready? Why would a loving God remain silent while you wrestle with fear, uncertainty, and emotional exhaustion? Why would He allow seasons where nothing seems to move despite your prayers? Those questions matter, because maybe the waiting season is not what you think it is. Maybe the silence is not empty. Maybe the delay is not rejection. Maybe something deeper is happening beneath the surface of your frustration. And if that is true, then the greatest struggle in this season may not be the waiting itself. It may be understanding what God is actually doing inside it. The longer you wait, the more your mind becomes a battlefield. Not always publicly, not always visibly, but internally. There is often a constant conversation happening beneath the surface of your daily life. A tension between what you believe about God and what your emotions are trying to convince you is true. And during seasons of waiting, that tension becomes impossible to ignore, because waiting has a way of exposing what truly controls your thoughts. At first, you may think the biggest struggle is the delayed answer itself, the unopened door, the uncertainty, the silence. But over Chimi, something deeper begins revealing itself. The real battle is often not around you. It is within you. The battle between truth and fear. The battle between faith and anxious thinking. The battle between what God has said and what your emotions keep repeating. That battle becomes especially intense when life feels paused, because when movement disappears externally, thoughts become louder internally. You start replaying situations repeatedly in your mind. Maybe you begin questioning decisions you already made. Maybe you wonder if you misunderstood God completely. Maybe you analyze every detail, searching for hidden explanations. And slowly, without realizing it, anxiety starts positioning itself as a source of protection. Your mind tells you that overthinking will keep you prepared. That worrying will help you avoid disappointment. That constantly analyzing your future will somehow create control. But the more you live inside fearful thinking, the more emotionally exhausted you become. Because the human mind was never designed to carry the weight of complete control. And waiting exposes that reality quickly, especially when you are desperately searching for certainty. You want reassurance? You want confirmation? You want visible evidence that God is still working? But often, during waiting seasons, God allows you to face the instability of your own thoughts before He changes your circumstances. That can feel uncomfortable because many people do not realize how much their emotional peace depends on visible progress. As long as life is moving, they feel secure. As long as prayers seem answered, they feel hopeful. As long as opportunities appear, they feel confident. But when external movement slows down, internal instability suddenly becomes visible. Waiting reveals what was already living inside the heart. That is why some people become consumed by fear during delays, while others develop deeper trust. The external situation may look similar, but internally, something very different is happening. And perhaps this is one of the hidden purposes of waiting. It reveals whether your mind is anchored in God's truth or controlled by anxious emotions. That revelation matters more than most people realize, because thoughts shape spiritual direction. If fear controls your thinking long enough, eventually it begins shaping your identity. You stop seeing yourself through truth and start seeing yourself through disappointment. You begin interpreting your life through lack instead of purpose. You'll become emotionally dependent on circumstances for peace. And this is dangerous because circumstances constantly change. One day you feel hopeful. The next day, you feel discouraged. One moment you feel strong spiritually. The next moment, you feel emotionally overwhelmed. If your peace depends entirely on visible outcomes, then your emotional stability will always remain fragile. This is why God often works on the mind before He changes the situation. Not to ignore your desires, not to dismiss your pain, but because transformation inside you is part of the answer itself. Still, many people resist this process because internal work feels invisible, and invisible growth rarely feels exciting. You cannot easily measure emotional maturity. You cannot immediately see deeper trust. You cannot physically observe spiritual endurance forming inside your heart. Yet those hidden developments often become the very foundation needed for future seasons of your life. Because God is not only interested in getting you somewhere, He is also concerned with who you become along the way. And waiting reveals who you are becoming. It exposes habits of thinking you may never have noticed during easier seasons. For example, waiting can reveal how quickly your mind assumes the worst, how easily fear creates false conclusions, how often your emotions define reality for you. Sometimes one unanswered prayer becomes proof in your mind that nothing good is coming. One delay becomes evidence that your future is failing. One closed door becomes confirmation that God is distant. But those interpretations are not necessarily truth. They are emotional reactions. And emotional reactions become dangerous when they are treated as spiritual facts. This is why Scripture repeatedly emphasizes renewing the mind. Not because thoughts are insignificant, but because the condition of your thinking deeply affects your ability to trust God. The Bible presents God's truth as stable and reliable, even when human understanding feels uncertain. During waiting seasons, your thoughts will either pull you toward peace or deeper into fear. And fear is persuasive. Fear always sounds urgent. It convinces you that immediate answers are necessary for security. It tells you that if you cannot see progress, then nothing is happening. It pressures you to panic before God's timing unfolds. But fear rarely tells the full truth. Fear only shows you what could go wrong. Faith reminds you that God still exists beyond what you currently see. That does not mean pretending emotions are not real. It does not mean ignoring disappointment. It means learning that feelings are not always trustworthy guides. You can feel abandoned and still be loved by God. You can feel uncertain and still be guided. You can feel delayed and still be moving toward purpose. That distinction changes everything. Because if you believe every fearful thought that enters your mind, waiting will slowly destroy your peace. And that destruction usually happens quietly, not through dramatic collapse, but through constant mental exhaustion, constant overthinking, constant comparison, constant internal pressure. You begin waking up already emotionally tired because your mind never truly rests. And sometimes the reason waiting feels unbearable is not only because of the delay itself, but because of the thoughts attached to it. Thoughts like, what if nothing changes? What if I stay here forever? What if I misunderstood God completely? What if I am running out of time? Those thoughts create emotional heaviness that God never intended you to carry alone. Yet many people live inside those fears daily without realizing how deeply anxiety is shaping their spiritual perspective. And here is what makes waiting especially difficult. Fear often sounds logical. It sounds practical. It sounds responsible. But many fearful thoughts are built on assumptions rather than truth. Because the human mind naturally tries to predict outcomes when certainty is missing. That is what uncertainty does to people. It tempts them to create conclusions before God reveals direction. And the longer the waiting lasts, the more tempting it becomes to let fear define reality. But maybe the purpose of this season is not only about what you are waiting for. Maybe it is also about what God is trying to free you from mentally. Free you from constant anxiety. Free you from emotional dependence on visible progress. Free you from needing control before you can experience peace. Because real trust is not tested when answers come quickly. Trust is revealed when clarity disappears and you still choose to believe God is good. That kind of faith does not develop instantly. It develops slowly, painfully sometimes, quietly, and usually in seasons where you cannot rely on your emotions alone. This is why waiting often feels spiritually exposing. God allows hidden thoughts to surface, not to shame you, not to condemn you, but to reveal what needs healing. Some people discover how much fear has been controlling them. Others discover how much their identity depends on achievement or progress. Others realize they have confused God's presence with emotional comfort. Waiting brings those deeper realities into the light. And while that process feels uncomfortable, it is also deeply important because God cannot heal what you continue hiding from yourself. And sometimes, silence removes distractions long enough for you to finally see what has been happening inside your heart all along. Maybe that is why this season feels so emotionally intense. Not because God is absent, but because He is revealing something deeper than the answer you originally asked for. Something about your thinking, something about your trust, something about the way fear has been shaping your perspective without you fully noticing it. And if that is true, then perhaps waiting is not simply delaying your future. Perhaps it is exposing the internal battles that would eventually damage your peace, even after the prayer is answered. One of the hardest parts about waiting is that it can make you feel invisible. You pray, but nothing seems to shift. You try to remain faithful, but your circumstances stay the same. You keep hoping for movement, yet day after day, everything appears unchanged. And eventually, a subtle conclusion begins forming inside the heart. If I cannot see progress, maybe nothing is happening. That belief becomes emotionally dangerous because human beings naturally associate movement with meaning. When things advance, we feel encouraged. When doors open, we feel reassured. When opportunities appear, we feel seen by God. But when life becomes quiet and progress slows down, many people begin interpreting silence as inactivity. Yet some of the deepest spiritual work God performs happens where human eyes cannot immediately recognize it. That is difficult to accept because visible progress feels emotionally safer than invisible growth. Visible progress gives reassurance. Invisible growth requires trust. And trust becomes difficult when your emotions are tired, especially when you compare your life to other people. Comparison intensifies waiting seasons more than many realize. Because while you are praying for clarity, someone else seems to already have answers. While you are struggling with uncertainty, someone else appears to be moving forward confidently. While you are waiting for one breakthrough, other people seem to experience constant opportunities. And if you are not careful, comparison will slowly convince you that God is working for everyone except you. That thought creates deep emotional discouragement, not only because you feel delayed, but because you begin feeling left behind. And when that feeling grows, trust becomes harder. You start measuring God's faithfulness through visible outcomes. You start evaluating your spiritual life based on external movement. You begin believing that if God were truly with you, things would be happening faster. But spiritual maturity cannot always be measured by speed. Sometimes what appears slow externally is actually deep transformation internally. The problem is that internal transformation rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It often feels ordinary, quiet, hidden. And because it is hidden, many people overlook it completely. Yet throughout Scripture, God repeatedly worked in hidden seasons before visible fulfillment arrived. The Bible consistently emphasizes that God's truth and purposes remain reliable, even when circumstances seem unclear to human understanding. That matters because waiting often creates the illusion that your life is standing still. But spiritually, standing still and being prepared are not the same thing. There are seasons where God appears silent externally while actively working internally. And sometimes the reason you cannot see progress is because the most important work is happening beneath the surface. Much like roots growing underground before fruit becomes visible. Roots develop in hidden places, quiet places, unnoticed places. But without deep roots, visible growth cannot remain stable later. And perhaps this is where many people misunderstand God's timing. They want visible results before invisible strength has fully formed. They want open doors before deeper maturity develops. They want the promise before the preparation feels complete. But God sees beyond the moment. He sees beyond emotions. He sees beyond temporary excitement. And because he sees the full picture, his priorities are often different from yours. You may be focused on arrival. God may be focused on foundation. You may be praying for speed. God may be developing stability. You may be asking, when will this happen? While God is asking, who are you becoming while you wait? That question changes the entire perspective of waiting. Because if waiting only feels valuable after visible answers arrive, then you will miss what God is doing right now. And what God does during hidden seasons often shapes future peace more than the answer itself. For example, many people think they need a changed circumstance to finally experience rest emotionally. But sometimes the real issue is not the situation. Sometimes it is the instability inside the heart. If fear controls your mind now, external success will not automatically remove that fear later. If anxiety dominates your thoughts now, opportunities alone will not create peace. If your identity depends on visible progress now, achieving your goals will only create temporary relief before new fears emerge. This is why waiting often exposes emotional dependencies people did not realize they had. Some people discover they have tied their worth to achievement. Others realize they only feel secure when life feels predictable. Others recognize that they trust God emotionally only when circumstances feel comfortable. These revelations are uncomfortable, but necessary, because God is not merely trying to improve your situation. He is transforming the way you live internally. An internal transformation requires deeper work than temporary emotional relief. Still, this process feels frustrating because your emotions naturally crave evidence. You want signs. You want confirmation. You want reassurance that your life is moving somewhere meaningful. And honestly, there are moments during waiting seasons where you may feel tempted to give up emotionally. Not always publicly, not dramatically, but quietly inside yourself. You stop expecting good things with the same confidence. You lower your hope to protect yourself from disappointment. You become emotionally cautious because disappointment has already exhausted you so many times. That is one of the hidden dangers of prolonged waiting. It can slowly train the heart to stop expecting. Not because you no longer believe in God intellectually, but because emotionally, you become afraid to hope fully again. Afraid that another disappointment will hurt too much. Afraid that another delay will deepen the exhaustion. Afraid that expecting something good will only create more pain later. So instead, you begin emotionally settling. You continue functioning spiritually, but internally, your hope becomes quieter, smaller, more guarded, and without realizing it, fear begins protecting itself by expecting less from life. But God never intended fear to become the foundation of your thinking. Fear narrows perspective. Fear interprets silence negatively. Fear assumes delay means failure. Fear sees closed doors and immediately creates hopeless conclusions. But what if delay is not always denial? What if some closed doors are actually protection? That possibility is difficult to accept emotionally because people naturally assume that anything delayed must be harmful. But not everything you desire immediately is something you are fully prepared to carry wisely. And not every opportunity arrives at the right time, simply because you feel emotionally ready for it. Sometimes your feelings tell you that you are prepared long before your heart is actually stable enough to handle what you are asking for. That truth can feel humbling because human beings often evaluate readiness based on desire, but God evaluates readiness based on deeper realities: character, wisdom, stability, trust, emotional maturity, spiritual endurance. And many of those things develop most deeply during hidden seasons. Not public victories, not exciting moments, not instant breakthroughs, but quiet waiting. This is why visible progress and spiritual progress are not always the same thing. You may feel like nothing is happening because external circumstances remain unchanged. Meanwhile, internally, God may be strengthening parts of you that will become essential later. Strengthening patience, strengthening wisdom, strengthening emotional resilience, strengthening your ability to trust Him beyond feelings. Those developments are harder to celebrate because they are less visible, but often they become the very reason future blessings do not destroy your peace later. Because without internal stability, even answered prayers can become burdens. Without maturity, opportunities can create pressure instead of peace. Without trust, blessings can produce fear of losing them. God sees those realities long before you do. And perhaps that is why waiting is sometimes necessary, even when you feel ready. Because readiness is not measured only by desire. It is also measured by the condition of the heart carrying the promise. And maybe the most difficult realization during waiting seasons is this: God's silence does not always mean He is withholding something from you. Sometimes He is protecting something within you. There is a painful truth many people discover during seasons of waiting. Wanting something deeply does not automatically mean you are fully prepared to carry it. That realization can feel uncomfortable because human beings naturally measure readiness through desire. If you have prayed long enough, suffered long enough, hoped long enough, then emotionally it feels reasonable to expect the answer now. You think, I've learned my lessons, I'm ready. But God sees deeper than visible desire. He sees the condition of the heart beneath the request. And sometimes waiting reveals that there are still areas inside you that need healing, strengthening, or surrender before the next season arrives. Not because God wants to punish you, not because He enjoys delaying your life, but because carrying something prematurely can damage you in ways you cannot yet see. That truth is difficult for the human heart, because waiting already feels painful enough. The idea that God may still be preparing you internally can initially sound discouraging, but preparation is not rejection. Formation is not abandonment. And sometimes the greatest expression of God's love is not immediate access, but intentional development. Because there are things you can desire emotionally that your heart is not yet stable enough to manage wisely. That happens more often than people realize. Some people ask God for greater responsibility while still being emotionally controlled by fear. Others ask for influence while secretly struggling with insecurity. Others pray for relationships while carrying unresolved wounds that would eventually create destruction. Others desire open doors while lacking the spiritual stability necessary to remain grounded once those doors open. And often, these deeper issues remain hidden until waiting exposes them. That exposure can feel frustrating because nobody likes seeing uncomfortable truths about themselves, especially truths connected to weakness, fear, pride, control, impatience, emotional instability. But hidden weaknesses do not disappear simply because you ignore them. And God loves you too deeply to allow certain things into your life before confronting what could eventually harm you. That is one reason waiting feels so spiritually intense. It brings hidden conditions of the heart into the light, not to shame you, but to prepare you. Because external blessings cannot create internal wholeness. Only God can do that. Yet many people unknowingly expect answered prayers to solve problems that are actually rooted much deeper inside them. They think, if this opportunity finally happens, I'll have peace. If this door finally opens, I'll stop feeling anxious. If this season finally changes, I'll finally feel secure. But external change alone rarely heals internal instability. In fact, sometimes success exposes emotional weakness even more clearly, because pressure increases when responsibility increases. And if your heart has not been strengthened beforehand, what once looked like a blessing can quickly become emotionally overwhelming. God understands that long before you do. That is why His timing is connected not only to the promise itself, but to the condition of the person receiving it. This changes the way you see waiting. Instead of viewing delay only as something happening to you, you begin realizing something is also happening within you. And perhaps this is where the deepest transformation begins. When you stop asking only, when will God change my situation? And start asking, what is God changing inside me during this season? That question requires humility, because it forces you to consider the possibility that readiness involves more than desire. It involves character, spiritual maturity, emotional endurance, trust, surrender. And many of those qualities are developed precisely through prolonged waiting. Not instant answers, not easy seasons, but uncomfortable uncertainty. Because uncertainty reveals what comfort often hides. It reveals whether your peace depends on control, whether your identity depends on achievement, whether your trust depends on visible reassurance, whether your relationship with God survives silence. Those are difficult questions, but necessary ones. And the longer waiting continues, the harder it becomes to avoid them, especially because waiting removes many distractions. When life moves quickly, people can hide from deeper internal struggles through activity and momentum, but waiting slows everything down. And in that slowing, hidden fears become visible. You start noticing how uncomfortable you feel without certainty, how much emotional security you place in outcomes, how difficult surrender truly is when timelines disappear. And perhaps this is why many people resist waiting so strongly. Not only because they dislike delay, but because waiting confronts the illusion of control. Human beings want to feel in charge of their future. They want predictable outcomes, clear direction, immediate reassurance. But waiting forces you to face the reality that some things remain completely outside your control. And that realization can either deepen fear or deepen surrender. At first, many people respond with fear. They try to regain control mentally. They overthink, overanalyze, force doors open, rush decisions, pressure themselves emotionally, anything to escape uncertainty. But eventually, exhaustion begins teaching what striving never could. That peace cannot come from controlling every outcome. Because no matter how hard you think, worry, plan, or analyze, you still cannot force God's timing. And maybe that is intentional. Maybe part of spiritual growth is learning that your safety was never supposed to come from control in the first place. Maybe God allows waiting because He is teaching you dependence beyond circumstances, dependence beyond visible answers, dependence beyond emotional certainty. That kind of surrender does not happen naturally. Human instincts resist it because surrender feels vulnerable, especially when you are tired, especially when prayers seem unanswered, especially when you feel emotionally ready for change. And yet, often in Scripture, God formed people deeply before entrusting them with greater responsibility. His truth remains reliable, not because circumstances always make immediate sense, but because His purposes extend beyond human understanding. That means your current frustration may not be evidence that God is against you. It may be evidence that He sees further than you do, further than your emotions, further than your current perspective, further than your immediate desires. And while that truth does not instantly remove the discomfort of waiting, it changes how you interpret the season, because now waiting is no longer meaningless delay. It becomes intentional formation. And intentional formation often feels uncomfortable precisely because it reaches deeper than surface-level change. God is not merely adjusting circumstances around you. He is strengthening the person within you, strengthening patience where panic once controlled you, strengthening trust where fear once dominated, strengthening wisdom where impulsiveness once led decisions, strengthening emotional stability where insecurity once created chaos. Those developments matter more than you currently realize, because eventually, the very qualities being formed in this hidden season may become the reason you can carry future blessings without being destroyed by pressure, pride, fear, or instability. Still, there remains a difficult tension here, because part of you may sincerely want God's will, but another part of you simply wants relief. Relief from uncertainty, relief from emotional exhaustion, relief from silence, relief from the constant tension of not knowing what comes next. And honestly, that desire is understandable. Waiting is heavy, especially when you feel like you have already endured enough. But sometimes God delays not because He is withholding good from you, but because immediate relief is not the deepest thing your soul needs. Sometimes your heart needs transformation more than comfort, and transformation usually happens slower than people want. That is frustrating for the human mind because people naturally prefer fast solutions. But deep roots are not formed quickly. Neither is deep trust. Neither is emotional maturity. Neither is spiritual endurance. Those things develop over time, quietly, hidden beneath the surface. And maybe that is what God has been doing all along. Not ignoring you, not forgetting you, not rejecting you, but preparing you in ways your emotions could not yet fully understand. Because one day you may look back at this season and realize something surprising. The waiting was not only about receiving the promise, it was about becoming the person capable of carrying it with wisdom, peace, and trust. One of the quietest heartbreaks during a waiting season is when prayer starts feeling heavy. Not because you no longer believe in God, but because you are emotionally tired of asking for the same thing over and over again. At first, prayer may have felt hopeful. You approached God with expectation. You believed change was close. You trusted that answers would come quickly. But as time passed, something inside you began shifting. Not always outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. Prayer slowly became more difficult because repeated silence can create emotional weariness. You still speak to God, but now there is tension behind your words. A hidden fear that maybe nothing will change. A quiet disappointment you do not always know how to explain. And perhaps what hurts most is not simply the waiting itself, but the feeling that your prayers seem to disappear into silence. You ask God for direction. Silence. You ask for clarity. Silence. You ask for movement. Silence. And eventually, your emotions begin interpreting that silence personally. You start wondering if God is distant, if He is disappointed in you, if you somehow failed spiritually, or maybe if He simply decided not to answer. That emotional struggle becomes even deeper because prayer is deeply connected to trust. When trust feels strong, prayer flows more freely. But when disappointment grows, prayer can begin feeling complicated. Not because God changed, but because fear slowly reshapes the way you approach Him instead of praying with openness. You begin praying cautiously, guardedly, protecting yourself emotionally from further disappointment. And without realizing it, prayer subtly shifts from relationship into transaction. You begin measuring God's love through outcomes. If answers come, you feel secure. If delays continue, you'll feel uncertain. But one of the deepest spiritual lessons waiting teaches is this: God's silence does not always mean absence. And prayer was never meant to function only as a tool for immediate results. It was meant to draw you into deeper dependence on God Himself. That truth sounds comforting at first, but honestly, it can also feel challenging because many people do not realize how much of their spiritual life depends on visible reassurance until reassurance disappears. When answers come quickly, trust feels easier. But when heaven feels quiet, your deeper motives begin surfacing. You start discovering whether your faith is rooted in God's presence or simply in His visible activity. That revelation matters because there is a difference between trusting God for what He gives and trusting Him for who He is. And waiting exposes that difference powerfully. At first, many people approach prayer primarily seeking change. Change the situation, change the timeline, change the outcome. And there is nothing wrong with bringing desires honestly before God. But prolonged waiting often transforms prayer itself. Slowly, prayer becomes less about demanding speed and more about learning surrender. That transition is difficult because surrender feels vulnerable, especially when your emotions are already exhausted. Part of you still wants immediate answers, immediate relief, immediate movement. But deeper spiritual maturity develops when prayer moves beyond urgency into trust. Trust that God still sees you even in silence. Trust that His wisdom extends beyond your current understanding. Trust that His timing is not cruelty, even when it feels painful emotionally. And that kind of trust rarely develops quickly. It usually develops through repeated moments where you choose to seek God despite uncertainty, despite disappointment, despite emotional fatigue. That process changes a person slowly, because eventually you begin realizing something important. Prayer is not only about getting God to move, it is also about allowing God to shape you. And often, the shaping happens most deeply during the seasons where answers seem delayed. That is difficult for human nature to accept because people naturally prefer visible breakthroughs over invisible transformation. But God often prioritizes eternal development over temporary emotional relief. And while that may not immediately remove the pain of waiting, it gives purpose to the process. Because now prayer is no longer only a desperate attempt to escape discomfort. It becomes a place where your heart is gradually being reshaped away from fear, away from control, away from emotional dependence on outcomes, toward deeper trust, toward surrender, toward peace that does not collapse every time circumstances remain unclear. Still, surrender does not happen automatically. There are days during waiting seasons when frustration returns strongly, days when you feel emotionally disconnected, days when prayer feels dry, days when your thoughts become loud again. And during those moments, many people assume they are failing spiritually. But spiritual growth is not the absence of struggle. Often, it is the decision to continue seeking God in the middle of struggle, even when emotions fluctuate, even when clarity feels distant, even when fear keeps trying to regain control. That persistence matters more than you realize, because every time you continue turning toward God instead of completely surrendering to fear, something inside you strengthens, not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, like muscles developed through resistance. And perhaps this is one reason waiting deepens prayer. Not because suffering itself is good, but because uncertainty strips away illusions of self-sufficiency. When life feels stable, people often rely on their own plans more than they realize. But waiting exposes how limited human control truly is. It forces deeper dependence, and dependence often creates intimacy with God that comfort never could. That intimacy is not always emotional. This is important to understand. Many people expect closeness with God to always feel emotionally intense or comforting. But some of the deepest spiritual growth happens quietly, beneath emotion. There are seasons where you may not feel strong emotionally, yet God is still working profoundly inside you. The Bible consistently presents God's truth as reliable beyond changing human feelings and circumstances, reminding believers that His purposes remain steady even when emotions fluctuate. That matters because emotions are unstable by nature. Some days you feel hopeful. Other days you feel discouraged. Some days prayer feels alive. Other days it feels difficult. But God's presence is not dependent on emotional intensity. And perhaps this is one of the hidden lessons of waiting. Learning to trust God beyond emotional confirmation that changes prayer completely. Because now you stop approaching God only when emotions feel strong. You begin learning how to remain connected, even when your feelings are uncertain, even when answers feel delayed, even when silence continues longer than expected. That kind of faith is quieter, deeper, more stable. It no longer depends entirely on emotional highs. And over Chini, something surprising begins happening. The same waiting season that once felt like punishment slowly becomes a place of transformation. You begin noticing subtle changes inside yourself. Maybe you react with less panic than before. Maybe fear no longer controls every thought. Maybe you are learning to sit in uncertainty without emotionally collapsing. Maybe your prayers sound less demanding and more surrendered, not because you stopped caring, but because your trust is becoming deeper than your timeline. That is not weakness. That is growth. And perhaps the greatest evidence that God is working is not always immediate external change. Sometimes it is the quiet transformation happening within you while nothing around you seems different. Still, there remains an important tension unresolved. Because even after learning surrender, even after deeper prayer, even after growing spiritually, there are still moments when confusion returns. You still wonder why God chooses silence sometimes. You still question why clarity feels delayed. You still wrestle with the emotional weight of uncertainty. And maybe the next step in this journey is realizing that waiting is not only teaching you how to trust God, it is also teaching you how to recognize His voice beyond fear, pressure, emotions, and human urgency. There comes a point in every waiting season where the real question is no longer, why hasn't God answered yet? The deeper question becomes, which voice am I listening to while I wait? Because waiting creates noise inside the mind. Fear speaks, pressure speaks, comparison speaks, emotions speak, past disappointments speak. And when uncertainty lasts long enough, those voices can become so loud that it becomes difficult to recognize what is actually true anymore. That is why many people feel spiritually confused during seasons of delay. Not because God disappeared, but because too many competing voices are shaping their perspective at the same time. Fear says you are falling behind. Pressure says you are running out of time. Comparison says everyone else is moving faster. Disappointment says nothing will ever change. And if those voices remain unchecked, they slowly distort the way you see both yourself and God. This is why waiting is not only about patience, it is also about discernment, learning how to separate truth from emotional noise, learning how to recognize God's direction beyond fear-driven thinking, learning how to stop allowing urgency to make decisions your spirit is not prepared for. Because urgency can become dangerous when it is fueled by anxiety instead of wisdom. Many people rush because they are uncomfortable with uncertainty. They force relationships, force decisions, force timelines, force outcomes. Not necessarily because those things are wrong, but because emotionally they cannot tolerate waiting anymore. And fear often disguises itself as urgency. It tells you that immediate action is necessary for survival, that if something does not happen quickly, your future is in danger. But God rarely leads people through panic. His direction often comes through peace, wisdom, and steady trust, rather than emotional chaos. That does not mean His guidance is always easy, but it means His voice does not operate the same way fear does. Fear pressures, God leads. Fear confuses, God brings clarity over time. Fear creates panic, God develops peace. even before circumstances change. And learning that difference is one of the most important spiritual lessons waiting can teach you. Because if you cannot discern the difference between fear and God's voice, anxiety will constantly control your decisions. You will mistake emotional pressure for divine urgency. You will rush into situations simply to escape discomfort. You will pursue temporary relief instead of lasting wisdom. And afterward, you may discover that what felt urgent emotionally was never truly aligned spiritually. This is why waiting seasons often slow people down intentionally. God removes constant movement long enough for deeper awareness to develop. Awareness of your thoughts, your motives, your fears, your emotional patterns, and especially the voices you have been allowing to shape your life. At first, slowing down feels frustrating because when you are emotionally uncomfortable, stillness feels unnatural. You want answers immediately, movement immediately, clarity immediately. But constant urgency makes it difficult to hear God clearly. Noise overwhelms discernment. Fear clouds wisdom. Pressure distorts perspective. And sometimes the reason God allows waiting is because He is teaching you to stop reacting impulsively to every emotion that enters your mind. That process changes a person deeply, because eventually you begin realizing that not every thought deserves your trust. Not every fear deserves your attention. Not every emotional impulse deserves immediate action. That realization creates maturity, especially spiritually, because mature faith does not react emotionally to every uncertain moment. It learns how to remain steady, even when feelings fluctuate. That steadiness becomes powerful during waiting seasons, because emotionally unstable thinking creates unstable living. One day you feel hopeful, the next day hopeless. One moment confident, the next moment afraid. And if emotions become the primary guide for your decisions, your life will constantly move according to fear rather than wisdom. But God's truth remains stable beyond emotional fluctuation. Scripture consistently points believers toward reliable truth rather than allowing fear or unstable emotions to define reality. That matters because waiting exposes how much people rely on feelings for direction. When emotions feel peaceful, they assume God is near. When emotions feel uncertain, they assume God is distant. But emotions are influenced by exhaustion, disappointment, stress, fear, and countless other factors. God's presence is deeper than emotional sensation. And learning that changes the entire spiritual journey, because now you stop needing constant emotional reassurance to remain faithful. You begin developing quieter trust, steadier trust, trust that survives silence, trust that survives confusion, trust that survives delayed answers. And slowly, something remarkable begins happening. The same waiting season that once made you feel abandoned begins producing discernment you never had before. You become more aware of how fear manipulates your thinking, more aware of how comparison steals peace, more aware of how urgency creates unnecessary pressure, more aware of how emotional exhaustion distorts perspective. That awareness is not accidental. It is part of formation, because God is not merely preparing your future. He's teaching you how to walk through life without being controlled by fear every time uncertainty appears. That kind of maturity cannot be developed instantly. It forms gradually through repeated moments where you choose trust instead of panic. Still, this process is not easy. There are moments where waiting still hurts. Moments where emotions still feel heavy. Moments where you still wish God would simply explain everything clearly. But perhaps if God explained every detail immediately, you would never learn how to trust Him deeply. You would trust explanations instead of trusting Him. And there is a difference. Explanations create temporary comfort. Deep trust creates lasting peace. That peace does not mean all questions disappear. It means fear no longer dominates your relationship with uncertainty. You stop needing immediate control to feel secure. You'll stop believing silence automatically means rejection. You stop assuming delay means failure. Instead, you begin recognizing something deeper. God may still be working, even when your emotions cannot yet understand what He is doing. That realization becomes the turning point, the moment where waiting starts looking different. Not easy, not painless, but purposeful. You'll begin seeing that perhaps God's silence was never empty after all. Perhaps while you were asking for immediate answers, God was developing discernment. While you were asking for visible movement, He was strengthening your inner stability. While you feared abandonment, He was teaching you how to hear His truth beyond emotional chaos. And suddenly, the season that once looked like rejection begins revealing hidden preparation. Not preparation only for what you will receive, but preparation for who you are becoming. Because one day, you may realize something that completely changes how you view this entire journey. God was never trying merely to give you what you wanted as quickly as possible. He was preparing you to live with peace, wisdom, stability, and trust long after the answer finally arrived. At the beginning of this season, you probably believed the hardest part would be the delay itself, the unanswered prayer, the silence, the uncertainty, the feeling that life was not moving the way you hoped. But now, after walking through the deeper layers of waiting, perhaps you can see something you could not recognize before. The waiting was never only about the answer. It was also about you, about what was happening inside your heart while you waited. Because somewhere along the way, something began changing. Not perfectly, not instantly, but gradually, quietly, deep beneath the surface. At first, fear controlled many of your thoughts. You measured God's love through visible progress. You interpreted silence as absence. You believed readiness was determined only by how strongly you desired something. But now you are beginning to understand something deeper. God's timing is connected to wisdom, not punishment. And wisdom sees what emotions cannot. That realization changes the entire meaning of waiting, because now you no longer see delay as evidence that God forgot you. You begin seeing that perhaps He was protecting you, preparing you, strengthening you, and teaching you in ways you could not fully understand before. And suddenly, the season that once felt meaningless begins carrying purpose. Not because the pain was imaginary, not because the struggle was easy, but because now you can recognize that God was doing more than you realized. He was teaching you how to trust Him beyond emotions, how to remain steady without constant reassurance, how to find peace without immediate control, how to separate truth from fear, how to pray with surrender instead of panic, how to recognize His presence even in silence. Those lessons are not small. They are because circumstances constantly change throughout life. There will always be future uncertainties, future delays, future moments where you do not immediately understand what God is doing. But now you are not the same person you were at the beginning of this journey. Something inside you has you may still have questions, but fear no longer defines every thought. You may still desire answers, but urgency no longer controls your spirit the same way. You may still feel emotions deeply, but you are beginning to understand that emotions are not the final authority over truth. That is growth, real spiritual growth. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep. And perhaps one of the most beautiful parts of this transformation is realizing that God's love was never measured by speed. For so long, you may have unconsciously believed that quicker answers meant greater love. That visible movement meant stronger favor, that immediate breakthroughs meant God was near. But waiting exposed something important. God can deeply love you while still allowing seasons of delay. Not because He enjoys your discomfort, but because His vision for your life is bigger than temporary emotional relief. He sees who you are becoming. He sees what future seasons will require from you. He sees the hidden fears, insecurities, wounds, and unstable places within the heart that still need strengthening. And because He loves you, He refuses to build your future on weak foundations. That truth may not always feel comforting emotionally in the moment, but one day you may look back with gratitude for prayers that were delayed instead of rushed. Because sometimes what you call waiting, God calls preparation. Preparation of the promise, preparation of the timing, preparation of the people involved, preparation of your character, preparation of your ability to carry the blessing without losing your peace. And now perhaps you finally understand why silence did not mean abandonment. God was present the entire time, present in the hidden growth, present in the uncomfortable stretching, present in the moments you thought nothing was happening, present while fear was being exposed, present while trust was being deepened, present while your heart was learning surrender the silence was never empty. It only felt empty because God was working beneath the surface where human eyes could not yet see. And honestly, that realization brings freedom, because now your peace no longer depends entirely on immediate answers. You still desire breakthroughs. You still pray. You still hope. But your relationship with God is becoming deeper than your timeline. You no longer need to panic every time life feels uncertain, because you have learned something waiting was trying to teach you all along. God's wisdom can be trusted even when His timing is difficult to understand. That does not mean every emotion disappears instantly. There may still be difficult days, moments where impatience returns, moments where fear tries to speak again, moments where uncertainty feels heavy. But now you know how to respond differently. You recognize fear faster. You stop allowing emotions to completely define reality. You return your mind to truth instead of panic. You remember that silence is not always rejection. You remember that visible inactivity does not mean God stopped working. You remember that waiting can still contain purpose, even when you do not yet see the outcome. And perhaps most importantly, you remember that your value was never determined by how quickly things happened in your life. You are not forgotten. You are not behind God's plan. You are not abandoned because answers took longer than expected. God's purposes are not limited by human timeline, and His care for you extends deeper than immediate comfort. The Bible consistently presents God's truth as stable, trustworthy, and reliable, even when human understanding is limited and emotions feel uncertain. That means you can trust Him here too, in this unfinished season, in this waiting, in this uncertainty. Not because you understand every detail, but because His character remains faithful, even when clarity is incomplete. And maybe that is the final transformation this season was leading you toward all along. Not perfect understanding, but deeper trust. The kind of trust that remains steady before the answer arrives. The kind of trust that survives silence. The kind of trust that no longer measures God's love through speed. Because now you understand something your fearful mind could not fully see before. God did not make you wait because you were forgotten. He made you wait because His purpose was preparing both the promise and the person receiving it. So if you are still in a waiting season today, do not assume nothing is happening. Some of the most important work God ever does occurs quietly, hidden beneath the surface, beyond emotions, beyond visible progress, beyond your current understanding. And one day, what now feels confusing may become the very reason your future stands on stronger ground. If this message spoke to something deep inside your heart, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more biblical encouragement and spiritual clarity. And remember this, a delayed answer is not always a denied future. Sometimes it is the evidence that God cares enough to prepare you before the door finally opens.